Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Center for International Security and Cooperation here at Stanford University. Welcome to those of you joining us online. My name is Harold Trinkunas. I'm the Deputy Director here at CSAC, also co-instructor with Dr. Rodhau Noack of the CSAC Honors Seminar this year. We're very glad to welcome all of you to the first of a series of presentations by our honors cohort this year, honors in interdisciplinary studies of international security. And each of the presenters are basically explaining, after they've labored mightily for over a year, what they've learned and what they've accomplished. They'll each have 20 minutes to present. We'll have 10 minutes for Q&A after. We're strict time limits because we have 3 of these to do today. And we'll start out with Joshua Hechtman, a firm Handshake, States, Corporations, and Diplomacy in the Levant. We're going in the order in which they were listed on the website, which is not alphabetical, generally because of when faculty advisors are available to participate. So please, Joshua, why don't you take us away?
Awesome. My name is Josh Hechtman, and today I'll be presenting my CSAC honors thesis, a firm Handshake, States, Corporations, and Diplomacy in the Levant. We get water from the enemy. This is what my Jordanian tour guide told me after I prompted a simple question. What is the water situation like here? No pretext, no prior mentioning of that enemy, and this was his instinctive response. Now imagine you're a government that gets its most critical resources from what much of your public deems as the enemy. How would you, as a state, get around those political constraints to cooperate? Well, Israel and Arab states in Levant have wrestled with this question for decades, and the solution started here. Yes, at a picnic table. In the late 1970s, Israel and Jordan faced a shared crisis that would lead to cooperation. The Yarmouk tributary, the Jordan River, essential to both nations' water security, was running low. And although direct negotiations remained untenable due to a lack of diplomatic relations between the two countries, neither could afford to ignore the threat of water shortages. So the solution emerged in what became known as the picnic table talks, clandestine meetings along the border where engineers, acting as private citizens rather than government officials, gathered at a picnic table to discuss water allocation. And decades later, Israel and Arab states in Levant would again seek these creative mechanisms to enhance resource cooperation. And this prompted my research question. How and under what diplomatic conditions do states deploy firms to facilitate cooperation? And to address this question, this presentation will proceed as follows. I'll first provide an overview of my literature review and explain my theoretical framework. I'll walk through my research design. I'll go through one of my empirical chapters, and I'll conclude with findings and takeaways. Before I continue, though, helpful to situate everyone on what I mean when I say the Levant. So this research takes a narrow definition, which includes modern-day Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria. So scholars have typically studied firms as diplomatic actors, primarily through the literature on corporate diplomacy. And this literature treats firms as autonomous agents that shape diplomatic outcomes, primarily through lobbying, relationship building, and indirect participation in conflict management. My research, though, reframes this literature by shifting the analytical focus to states and how states strategically utilize or deploy firms for diplomatic ends. In this context, the firm is a passive actor used by the state. And to conceptualize this, I draw on international mediation theory and Robert Putnam's 2-level game. First, Tuval and Zartman identify one of the key mediator functions as that of the communicator, making contacts and carrying or holding concessions. And while scholars have noted that in addition to states, non-governmental actors such as international organizations like the UN or NGOs can act in this mediator role, little attention has been given to firms and their role as mediators. Second, I ground this research in Putnam's 2-level game. So Putnam argues that international negotiation occurs at the level of the international level and the domestic level, and bargaining between both creates a win set for a state. And when two states' win sets overlap, agreement is possible. And notably, Putnam argues that the politicization of agreements often mobilizes groups who are typically less concerned about the costs of agreement. This reduces the space for compromise and thus shrinks the win set, which I show in the bottom diagram. And this research assumes the inverse is also true, that the depoliticization of agreements reduces the mobilization of groups who are often more opposed to cooperation. And this is where the firm comes in. So this study introduces the idea that states can deploy firms as buffers to frame politically contentious interstate cooperation as private sector agreements, depoliticizing it in turn, as well as communication intermediaries to transmit political messages and act on behalf of the state. And while these first two functions are reflected in the prior literature, my research revealed a third option that hasn't been discussed so far, and I'll elaborate on this presentation, and that's the firm as a firewall. So to help understand this, it might be difficult to see in the back, but I developed a model that shows how states utilize firms to facilitate cooperation. In the top panel, shared interest between state A and state B create an unconstrained win set, and thus cooperation is possible. And in the middle panel, political costs, which I don't know if you can see, but they're denoted by the red lines, reduce the win set and reduce the value of cooperation, and thus prevent agreement. And in the bottom panel, I show that states deploy firms as buffers, as firewalls, and as communication intermediaries to expand the win set and expand the value of cooperation of both states despite the presence of political costs. And this leads me to three hypotheses. I first hypothesized that states deploy firms as diplomatic actors to facilitate cooperation, regardless of the type of diplomatic relations. Second, I hypothesized that under conditions of formal relations, states primarily deploy firms as political buffers to overcome domestic opposition. And then under conditions of no diplomatic relations, states deploy firms both as buffers and as communication intermediaries. And to test these hypotheses, I conducted the following methodology. So I first created an interview procedure. Second, I conducted 35 semi-structured interviews with officials both directly and indirectly involved in the negotiations of each case study. These include former U.S. Special Envoy Amos Hochstein, former Assistant Secretary of State David Schenker, the former Crown Prince of Jordan, Prince Hassan, and the former Minister of Energy of Israel, Yuval Steinitz. And most of these interviews occurred during a field research trip in December of 2024 to Israel, Jordan, and the UAE. I also analyzed statements and data from officials that I could not access, looking at patterns of how they framed the agreement, whether they mentioned the firm by name or the state by name. And I then coded this data in vivo, kind of conducting a broad brush, more inductive approach. And then from those codes, I conducted thematic analysis, drawing out themes to understand how individuals made meaning of the state's use of the firm. So I invested 3 cases of Israeli-Arab water and energy cooperation in the Levant. First was the 2016 Israel-Jordan gas deal. Second was the 2021 Water for Energy Agreement between Israel and Jordan and brokered by the UAE, which became known as Project Prosperity. And finally, the 2022 Lebanon-Israel Maritime Agreement brokered by U.S. Special Envoy Amos Hochstein. And for the purposes of this presentation and my limited time, I'm going to focus on this last case, but if anyone has questions on the first two, happy to answer them in the Q&A. So let's dive in. On July 2nd, 2022, Lebanese political and militant organization Hezbollah launched 3 drones towards Karish, a natural gas field located 80 kilometers off the eastern Mediterranean coastline, estimated to contain $40 billion in untapped resource value. And while the IDF promptly intercepted these drones, Hezbollah's provocation marked a dangerous escalation in the maritime border dispute between Israel and Lebanon, 2 states without diplomatic relations, without recognition of each other's borders, and legally and often kinetically at a state of war. And the drone confrontation was the culmination of nearly 15 years of competing maritime claims filed with the United Nations. Lebanon's 2010 submission, known as Line 23, was followed by Israel's 2011 submission, known as Line 1. And while both states invoked principles of international maritime law, their diverging methodologies produced an 860 square kilometer disputed zone rich in hydrocarbon resources. And this included the Kana prospect, as shown there, and it cut across both maritime lines. And the dispute intensified in late 2020 when Lebanon introduced a new claim, Line 29, seen in blue. And this claim now encompassed portions of the Karish gas field, which was previously under a tacit understanding of Israeli territory. So to Lebanon, Israel would be extracting resources and thus wealth from Lebanese waters, and thus prompted the drone attack. But this revision did not occur in isolation. It was driven by Lebanon's severe economic collapse. Between 2019 and 2021, Lebanon's GDP fell by 60%, from roughly 50 billion to 20 billion. And one striking consequence of this collapse was that of the energy sector. During this time, electricity was provided for just 2 to 3 hours per day. So energy and revenue was needed, and this prompted a diplomatic opening. The Trump administration, led by Assistant Secretary of State David Schenker, restarted a US-led mediation process, hoping that this economic collapse would prompt diplomatic flexibility. But ultimately, that attempt failed. And when the Biden administration took office in 2020, US Special Envoy Amos Hochstein returned as mediator. And Hochstein aspired to shift negotiations away from explicit questions of border access towards questions of resource allocation and compensation, a reframing from political to commercial. And instead of a single comprehensive agreement, he introduced a bifurcated model. One part addressed territorial boundaries, the maritime line, and the other addressed resource compensation, why the maritime boundary was needed. And to advance this model, Hochstein explained that he had to bring in international energy firms such as Total Energies, which is a French quasi-state-owned company. But after that, there were still two primary roadblocks that prevented agreement. First was Lebanon's law number 1, 1955, which prohibits any agreement with Israel, including commercial deals, financial transactions, or any transactions of any nature whatsoever. This made it very difficult to conduct a deal with Israel. Second, Hochstein had to convince Hezbollah to get on board. And to overcome resistance from then Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah, Hochstein explained that he had to frame the agreement as a beneficial gas deal to the Lebanese public, positioning Hezbollah's opposition as contrary to the public good. So to overcome the legal hurdle, Hochstein designed a structure through which each party would engage independently with Total through two separate commercial agreements. And this in turn would satisfy the main objective, settling the border dispute. And this was particularly important in the case of the Kana gas prospect, which, as I mentioned, straddled both sides of the maritime line. So under the new agreement, the Kana prospect became a sovereign Lebanese entity and Karish became a sovereign Israeli entity. But to address Israel's claims to gas discovered on its side of the maritime borderline, Total would pay Israel directly instead of Lebanon. And this would avoid any direct engagement between the two countries, but it would inevitably detract from revenues from Lebanon of an entity now owned. And Section 2 of the official agreement outlines this financial workaround. So the emphasis on the two states separately engaging in discussions and Lebanon not being responsible for or party to any arrangement between the Block 9 operator, Total, and Israel and Lebanon really showcases this kind of independent agreement. In other words, as Schenker put it, it helps Lebanon maintain the fiction of non-engagement and the plausible deniability of violating their own laws. What's more is that structuring the agreement this way expanded Lebanon's win set by enabling a very convenient narrative. In fact, Nasrallah, as Hochstein desired, framed the agreement as an economic victory that would help Lebanon cope with their economic crisis rather than a deal with Israel. Moreover, Lebanese President Michael Aoun stated that no direct talks or agreements were concluded with Israel, and Speaker of the Parliament, Nabi Berri, then used this framing to circumvent the need for parliamentary approval in Lebanon. Thus, he removed the deal from the political process altogether by using this framing. In other words, Lebanon used the firm as a buffer. Meanwhile, Israeli Prime Minister Yair Lapid emphasized that this historic deal meant implicit recognition from Lebanon of the state of Israel, marking a major diplomatic achievement for the country. And Hochstein elaborated on this divergent framing. He stated that Hezbollah always called it a gas deal. And the Israelis said, we're not doing it with Total, we're doing it with the Americans and Lebanon. So you had a mismatch, and that was okay. Everybody got the joke. Moreover, this was deliberate from Hochstein. When asked whether Israel and Lebanon used Total as a justification mechanism to reach an agreement, Hochstein replied, of course it was. We set it up for that because Lebanon is not paying for the gas, Total is paying for it. But come on, that's obviously a fig leaf. And this fig leaf was the very mechanism through which an agreement was made possible. And Hochstein was intentional about this. So going back to Putin's two-level game, deploying the firm expanded the win set by enabling each country to present the deal in domestically palatable terms. And for Lebanon in particular, it enabled the country to maintain plausible deniability of violating its own laws, and also avoided any perception of normalization or cooperation with Israel. Because to them, like I mentioned, this was a gas deal with Total, not a border deal with Israel. Furthermore, Section 3 of the agreement states that in the event of gas discovery, each party shall share data on any natural resources with the United States. But this paragraph misses a crucial intermediary step. Hochtman explained that TotalEnergies acted as the first step to transfer that data. Thus, the strategic use of the firm went beyond rhetoric and beyond financial compensation. It enabled the very implementation of the agreement, because even after negotiations, Lebanon and Israel would not have to engage directly with one another. They would just go through the firm. Importantly, though, Total's role remained carefully bound to technical intermediation only. Unlike Tuval and Zartman's conception of the mediator as communicator, which I explained earlier, Total abstained from direct political communication. That was all done through the US. And so in this case, the buffer function alone was insufficient to reach a resolution. Hochtman deployed the firm in another manner to maintain institutional separation between the two states. And in this context, a new function emerges for my data, which I deem the firm as a firewall. I argue that Hochtman deployed the firm to embed legal, political, and structural distance directly into the agreement structure. In other words, as a firewall. And this enabled Hochtman to facilitate a border deal under the guise of two separate commercial agreements. As Hochtman summarizes here, the US used the commercial side to enable the border deal. And the commercial side was really just a mechanism to get that done. So the Lebanon-Israel Maritime Agreement not only represents a diplomatic breakthrough between two countries without diplomatic relations, but it also reveals a broader insight from my thesis. Under conditions of no relations between states, firms do not merely just depoliticize diplomacy, they can help construct the space in which such diplomacy becomes possible in the first place. And this brings me to my findings. Now, I can only cover one case in this presentation. I'm hoping to elaborate on the data across all three. So for all three cases, states deployed firms to facilitate cooperation, which supports my first hypothesis. And under conditions of formal relations, the state deploying the firm as a buffer, that is whether it's framed as a commercial agreement or an intergovernmental accord, depended on the broader geopolitical context, which I show in my analysis of the 2016 gas deal versus that of Project Prosperity. And finally, under conditions of no diplomatic relations, the buffer function was present, but the communication intermediary function was not. And this contrasts Project Prosperity again, where the Emirati state-owned renewable energy company Masdar was the negotiator on behalf of the Emirati state. And this shows that how the firm is utilized or how it is deployed often depends on the corporate structure, that is whether or not it is state-owned. And additional findings include the firm as a firewall function, and as I mentioned, the firm structure and its identity determine how states strategically deploy firms. And what I mean by identity is whether it's American, Lebanon, or American, Arab, or French, often has to do with the trust of the countries involved in the agreement. So across all three cases, the firm was an enabling function to expand the win set and produce agreement. And the typology that emerges, the buffer, the firewall, and the communication intermediary function, not only clarifies the distinction between each role and how the presence of each function depends on the relationship between the diplomatic relations between each country, but it also contributes to the broader literature. First, contributes to the literature on corporate diplomacy by showing that states or firms are not always self-directed actors in international affairs, but are often tools deployed by the state. Second, it expands the literature on international mediation by showing that in addition to states and international organizations and NGOs, firms can act as third-party mediators, particularly when they are state-owned. And finally, it extends Putnam's two-level game by identifying the firm as a strategic tool that states leverage to expand their win set. And I want to end just by showing two photos that I captured during my field research trip. So on the left is the Abrahamic family house in Abu Dhabi, which is home to an active mosque, an active synagogue, and an active church, all in one facility. It's very much the representation of the aspiration for coexistence in the region. On the right is a photo I captured at the Gaza border from southern Israel. It's this juxtaposition between the possibility of cooperation and the reality of war that has really been much been the inspiration for my research over the past year. And today, the Levant and the greater Middle East face a paradoxical tension. On one hand, there is a growing desire for Israeli-Arab cooperation in the region. Investment in emerging technologies, water, energy, food insecurity, and countering regional threats from Iran all incentivize cross-border diplomacy. On the other hand, overt political engagement with Israel has become incredibly costly for Arab states following October 7th, the subsequent war. It's precisely at this tension, though, where recognizing and understanding the mechanisms that push diplomacy forward in the region becomes essential. And this research has shown that firms offer a practical, if imperfect, mechanism to do just that. Thank you. Questions?
Okay, we have about 10 minutes for questions, and by tradition, the faculty advisor asks the first question. I see some other hands. Raise your hands if you want to get on the queue.
Great. Thanks, Josh. It's a really great project, and the presentation was terrific. The research is great. The thesis primarily looks at the way in which firms are instrumentalized by states to achieve the objectives that you talk about, as a mediator, as a form of communication, as a buffer, as this firewall. You hinted a little bit at it in your presentation, but could you say a little more about whether there's anything about the particular nature of particular types of firms that actually enables them to play this role? So obviously the national interest is there to instrumentalize firms. Well, what types of firms are best situated to actually play the roles that you're hypothesizing?
Yeah, I think there's two. The first, as I mentioned, the actual structure of the firm, whether or not it's state-owned. If a firm is state-owned, you can typically deploy it as more of a communication intermediary, more of like a typical mediator function to act on behalf of the state. And the project prosperity function case really exemplifies that. But in all three cases, the 2016 gas deal, so I'll just give a quick summary. The Jordanians said, this isn't a deal with Israel, this is a deal with the American-owned company Noble Energy. And so in that case, Jordan leveraged its strategic ally with the US to mitigate domestic opposition. And with the Project Prosperity case, Masdar being Arab-owned Emirati company really allowed for trust building between Israel and Jordan, which they didn't have by themselves. And multiple interviewees mentioned that said, we Israel and we Jordan did not have trust with each other, and so bringing in Masdar as a kind of a third party, as an Emirati-owned company, really allowed for us to recognize that this deal is possible. And they had kind of the commercial arm and also the government arm. And then with the Total Energies case, obviously Total Energies is a French quasi-state-owned company, and the French have had a long political interest in Lebanon since the League of Nations mandate for Syria and Lebanon following World War I. And so that provided some form of trust and legitimacy to the Lebanese. So there is a real, I couldn't measure it, but in all three of the cases, interviewees mentioned that, having a firm whose, country backer, for lack of a better word, is one that they share a relationship with, really helped allow states to deploy these firms in these ways.
I have Herb, and then I have right in front of you. You'll be after her. And short questions and short answers, so we can try to fit as many people in as possible.
Thank you. That was great. My question follows on Colin's, I think. Obviously, Total has to be a party that's trusted by both sides. What is it that companies can do to cultivate that kind of trust? What is it? What's special about Total that enables it to be trusted by both sides?
Yeah, I think again, it is a quasi-state-owned company. So it had that political backing and that trust. They're, I guess, party to the state, but they're shielded by the state. So they act, autonomously on behalf of the French government. I think, with today, Trump being in the Gulf right now, having OpenAI and all these, private companies there, they are independent actors, but they're very much, tools deployed by the current administration. So I think having some ties, some connection, be that through a corporate structure, just the very nature of the space it's in, really helps for states, utilize and deploy firms in certain ways.
Josh, I thought that was a fabulous presentation. Thank you very much. So in the case of Project Prosperity with water, I'm wondering if you, as a result of your study here, have come to some conclusion, because that project is on hold right now.
Mm.
Right, and I know it involves a important civil society actor, EcoPeace Middle East. So do you think that that is an important element of this as you looked at, the firm, or is this only commercial entities that we're talking about? Because what you haven't described here yet, which I'd love to know is, what are the economic flows? Like, what are we talking about in terms of how much money was connected to the gas deal before and after the gas deal? And, what might we see for the water deal?
Yeah, on the gas deal. So ironically, they haven't actually discovered gas in that field. So it wasn't actually a gas deal. It just enabled the border deal. But with Project Prosperity, I think, as you mentioned, EcoPeace Middle East is the NGO that kind of promoted that agreement. It's a trilateral NGO in the Middle East with offices in Tel Aviv, Ramallah, and Amman. And it shows that, in addition to firms, entities beyond states can often, fill the hole and fill the gap when, governments are in tension. And I think, this shows that, but there's also room for, other entities like, NGOs to facilitate cooperation when governments are in conflict, but the people, want some form of cooperation.
Let's see, we have time for one or two more. Let's actually go to new people in the back. I know, Sophie, you, and then behind as well.
Great job, Josh. Yeah, one quick question. One thing that I find interesting about the case that you presented is that it sort of requires underplaying the relationship with Israel from the Lebanese side. As, let's say, hypothetically, these deals become more common and more transparency becomes, pervasive around these deals. What do you think the long-term effects would be? Do you think it, desensitizes the Lebanese public and incentivizes cooperation, or potentially creates backlash?
It's a good question. I think, when I was doing my field research trip, everyone, acknowledged that they knew this was an agreement with Israel, and it was totally just a ploy by the government to, attempt to either mitigate opposition rhetorically, or, as was the case with the maritime agreement, remove the deal from the political process altogether. So I think, at the end of the day, they'll have to be transparent, but I don't think the relations are there yet, especially following the war. And this is a starting point to have some form of water and energy and critical resource exchange. So, I agree, it'd be nice 10 to 15 years from now if, you could be transparent that this is an intergovernmental accord. And you saw that with Project Prosperity. It was framed as this grand, agreement between Israel, Jordan, and the UAE following the Abraham Accords. But right now, the world isn't there yet in the Middle East. So you kind of have to have these creative workarounds, which is unfortunate. It's just the reality.
Okay, I think last question.
Yeah, fantastic job, Josh. Really well done. So I'd be curious if you think any other nation beyond the US could kind of play that facilitating role in, bringing together Israel and these Arab states, particularly, with like Trump's recent visit to the Middle East that's so focused on making deals, but almost seems less focused on diplomacy and doesn't even include Israel. So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think you're seeing that with, the Emiratis and the Saudis really want to fill that role. The Emiratis love to punch above their weight in that regard, and that's why they mediated the Project Prosperity Agreement and used their state-owned firm Masdar to kind of facilitate that. And then Saudi could also act as a mediator. Obviously, there's no diplomatic relations between Israel and that country yet, but in the case that there would be, you can imagine a scenario where the firm is take Gaza reconstruction, for example. You can imagine a scenario if there's the construction of desalinated water facilities, and the Saudis and the Emiratis, or the Saudis and the Israelis, want to go in on an investment. You can imagine the Emiratis kind of using Masdar as kind of a negotiator to broker that deal. There's other cases where this has been the case in the Gaza Marine, which is a natural gas field off the coast of Gaza, where Egypt kind of acted as the mediator through its state-owned energy company, EGAS. So doesn't have to be international.
Great. Well, join me in thanking Josh for the presentation. And as our next presenter gets set up, I know some of you might not be able to stay the whole time, so if you have to quietly sneak out, now's your time to do it. And I see new people joining us as well, so. Okay, great. Ready to start the next presentation. Market impact or competition, motivations behind US private investment in Africa's digital infrastructure. And come on in, let's just give people like 30 seconds to settle down before we get started. There'll be a 20-minute presentation, then we'll have about 10 minutes for Q&A at the end.
Sorry. Yes, Dr. Call. It's right there. Yeah. Well, hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here today. I see a lot of familiar faces. Thank you. My name is Zhenwei. I'm a senior at Stanford studying international relations and public policy, and today I'll be presenting my CSAC honors thesis. Last year, American tech giant Microsoft announced a collaboration with G42, a UAE-based AI and cloud computing company, for a $1 billion project to build a hyperscale data center in Kenya. 3 years before that, Meta unveiled the Two Africa Initiative, one of the world's largest subsea cable projects designed to improve global internet capacity, starting with the underserved regions in Africa. Even earlier in 2019, before its industry competitors, Google introduced this Ikiano cable project, a subsea cable that connects the Europe to West Coast, Africa's West Coast. To further visualize the scale of these projects, Africa is the second largest continent in the world, more than 3 times the size of the United States. Africa also has some of the youngest and fastest growing populations, and by 2050, more than a third of the world's young people live in Africa. So the continent is a potential market for a lot of digital expansion and economic growth. So as you can see on the left here, Google's Ikiano cable connects the entire west coast of the continent, landing entries in Lagos, Nigeria, also Cape Town, South Africa. Whereas for Meta's Two Africa Initiative, it has 25 plus landing entries across the entire continent. And again, I think this map is a little skewed. Imagine this is 3 times the size of the United States, which is huge. But the question really is why? And this is interesting and puzzling because US didn't always historically invest this much in Africa. In 2014, the Bureau of Economic Analysis shows that investments in Africa accounted for only 1.4% of the US's total outbound investments that year, whereas Latin America and Asia, 2 other developing regions, receive about 20 times of the amount invested in Africa the same year. Secondly, there's a surge of US venture capital investments in Africa's digital infrastructure, particularly software, starting in 2018 and 2019. As you can see here, 2018, 2019, you see an influx compared to 2017, and obviously 2021, there's a huge spike. And then 2022 obviously went down a little bit, but 2020, it's starting from the period of 2018 and 2019 was when there was a huge increase. Finally, it's also worth noting that as part of the Belt and Road Initiative, China has actually poured the most amount of capital in Africa compared to other developing regions the Belt and Road Initiative has projects in, up to what Committee on Foreign Affairs estimate to be around 250 to even like $300 billion in recent years. Chinese companies, Huawei and ZTE in particular, under the BRI, has actually dominated what experts estimate to be 70% of the 4G network digital infrastructure on the continent. So that these 3 conditions lead to my research question: what motivates private US technology companies to surge of investments in Africa's digital infrastructure? But before going directly into my research and findings, you've heard of me repeating this phrase like digital infrastructure so many times, and it feels like something like a data internet backbone, which is correct. But to make sure that everyone's on the same page, I'm going to give a quick breakdown. I like everyone to imagine digital infrastructures as an iceberg. So at the tip of the iceberg, you have something called the application or service infrastructure. So think about every time that we're going on our phones, we're Googling things, we're clicking on websites. These are essentially the application or software infrastructures and the platforms that we interact with on the daily. Just beneath the surface of the water, kind of in between, that powers these application infrastructure is something called the network infrastructure. And these are the physical cables and routers and the software protocols that essentially allow our devices, computers and phones and iPads to kind of communicate, exchange data within a network. So we'll actually have a really fast, convenient user experience, so it doesn't take forever to load things. Finally, what we don't think about most of the time, actually hidden under our radar, that powers both the network and the application infrastructure is something called the physical infrastructure. I think this is pretty intuitive in its wording. Like, think about roads and bridges as physical infrastructures that power our transportation systems. Essentially, these are the physical infrastructures that powers our digital systems. So most importantly, without these physical infrastructures, we literally do not have the internet, we don't have the network, we wouldn't have the application. And these are the infrastructures that are the focus of my thesis. And for example, what they include are something called the data centers, which I talked about in the very beginning, and what Microsoft is actually investing to build in Kenya. And obviously, we've heard in the news a lot regarding a lot of huge AI research labs saying that like these data centers are crucial for artificial intelligence development. At the same time, there's something called the subsea cables, which were actually literally laid on this ocean floor bed that actually powers about 90% of the global data transmission. So next time you're calling a family member that like lives across the like countries, across the oceans, make sure to thank subsea cables. They're really the ones that made it possible. So again, given how critical these physical infrastructure really is, why are American companies investing in Africa? And what really explains the surge that started in 2018 and 2019? So existing literature suggests that when it comes to making investment decisions in a developing region such as Africa, a key indicator is simply market opportunity, which refers to the potential of that investment region or Africa for long-term profit generation. Recall that I said in the very beginning that Africa will have the largest young population by the mid-century. And, you know, young people like us, we love to go on the internet and download new apps. And these people are just like us, and they're eager to kind of hop on the internet and be a part of the digital economy. Another indicator is something called the corporate social impact, where essentially what that means that firms are basically aligning their business goals with positive socioeconomic outcomes. Think about building a data center in Kenya. That means that they're going to have to employ local construction workers and IT supporters. These projects actually drive a lot of new economic opportunities. And finally, I am interested in the new paradigm around, well, a lot of the popular media today called the rise of geopolitical competition with China, which may have incentivized US firms to pursue strategic investments in order to compete directly with Chinese firms on the continent. And these three hypotheses are tested using two types of data. First are public statements published by Microsoft, Meta, and Google, and also private interviews conducted with company employees in these three companies, US government officials, and other experts familiar with the subject matter. So what did my research actually find? First, I found that there exists a discrepancy between public statement and private interviews in attributing market opportunity or corporate social impact as a key motivator. For example, looking into the public statement combined from Microsoft, Meta, and Google, a greater than majority of them actually cite corporate social impact as a key motivator, with market opportunity in the following in the blue. However, in private interviews, I found the company employees mentioned that market opportunity actually dominates over corporate social impact. It's not that companies do not think about the social impact they have, it's just when they're making these investment decisions, they think more about the market potentials and the returns on their investments more. Specifically, a former Microsoft and Google employee mentioned that these decisions are mostly commercial and that companies think about the impact over their business models more. A Google representative mentions that profit does matter, but not in the short run, but rather in the long term, suggesting that like when these companies are looking into emerging markets, they know that they have to be patient given how underdeveloped a region like Africa really is. So they're really looking to invest today for a long-term return in decades after. Meta echoed these statements where they predict that Africa will be a bigger market in the future and that the company will like to take part of that. And these results really echoed the literature review, which shows the companies typically most immediately consider market opportunity and the return from their investments. And for public relations and reputation reasons, these decisions are typically justified in the lens of social impact. Again, social impact is not that it's not something thought about, it's just, it's not a priority compared to market opportunity. I also found that market conditions are key determinants for which countries on the continent the companies are likely to invest in. And these selection criteria are typically on paper, GDP or market potential. What that really means is whether or not a country is politically or economically stable, whether or not the country is safe, whether or not it has some sort of robust form of rule of law. Recall that Google's Ikiano cable project has landing entries in Nigeria and South Africa, and they make sense because they're precisely the highest GDP countries on the continent, and they're economically and politically stable compared to other countries in the continent. Another factor is just literally reliable, consistent electricity and energy sources. I think every day for us, we turn on the switch lights and it's very easy to kind of get power, energy. But a lot of the times, these are not consistent energy sources. And this has proven true because Microsoft's data centers actually will be built on a region, Kenya, called Okaria, which actually sits on top of geothermal energy that will provide clean, consistent energy and power. And finally, basic public infrastructure such as roads and bridges for literally when you're transporting the raw construction materials to the building site is obviously critical. Furthermore, local governments in Africa can further help incentivize private sector investments by, simply put, quote unquote, having a skin in the game. So what does that really mean? That means having land or energy incentives for these private companies to go in, cheaper energies and cheaper lands, or priority of energy and priority supplies of energy. This means fast track permits to build have on their construction sites. This also means the neutral and or positive regulations that is welcoming different sorts of investments. Through private interviews, I've also found the competition with China is not viewed in a geopolitical sense, but rather as a business competitor. And this finding is supported by experts at Google and Meta, who pointed out that Chinese companies have an impressive penetration into the African market and that they're very aggressive. From these interviews, I got a sense of urgency that these private companies would like to have a bigger share of the market, but market conditions, as I talked about in findings 2, actually are some of the hard restraints. Specifically, these interviewees mentioned that unlike their Chinese competitors were financed by the Chinese government, these Chinese companies actually can't afford building some of the supporting energy or sort of basic road infrastructures to kind of build their projects. But compared to for US private companies, the unit economics just doesn't make sense. They can't afford building extra supporting infrastructures without having a return on it. They can't justify the sort of the profit from that. But what is really surprising is that unlike its industry competitors, Microsoft, in some of its public statements written by its president, Brad Smith, and legal counsel that testify in front of Congress, actually explicitly spelled out geopolitical competition with China and Africa as a key motivator, which is actually an anomaly if you recall the Meta and Google case. I didn't really get a direct answer in that case, but we can speculate a couple reasons why geopolitical competition is particularly cited. Maybe it's a leadership personal ideology, right? Perhaps the president, Brad Smith, or their legal counsel really do believe that, Microsoft should be investing more in Africa because this is a geopolitical competition, given the increasing tension between the US and Chinese government. Perhaps this is another case of discrepancy between public statements and private narratives. What they put out in the public is very different than what they think about in private, as discussed in finding 1. And finally, Microsoft is the leading cloud provider in their Azure system for the US government. So there could be other internal partnerships, pressure points, or other reasons that the public and most employees at Microsoft, other than the C-suite level, are aware of. After all, this is the CEO of Satya Nadella at Microsoft and President Trump, January of this year, earlier during Trump's inauguration. I'm not really sure what conversation went down, but it seems to be a really pleasant one. And on that point of public-private partnership between US government and Microsoft, I found that the surge of investments in 2018 and 2019 is correlated with the alignment with US foreign policy interests to counter Chinese influence on the continent. Specifically, President Trump began discussing his Africa strategies or announcing it publicly. This is a White House press release in late 2018. And he unveiled something called the Prosper Africa Initiative, which is an effort to kind of boost two-way trade and investment between the United States and African nations. You can see the DC media actually were quite fond of this initiative, with a lot of media saying that it's very optimistic that this new US Africa strategy could be very useful in terms of countering Chinese influence. The initiative was indeed very fruitful when the Kenya government official told me that for the first time in 2019, I quote, US government and private sector were actually sitting in the same room when they're negotiating with local African governments, where before US government did not seem to be very involved in private sector deal making. And this was also echoed by a State Department official who said that there has been an increased effort from the State Department in terms of becoming a better messenger and connector in terms of facilitating conversations with American companies and African governments or vice versa. As proof of the aligned interest between US government and private companies at the time, Microsoft's partnership with G42 for Kenya's data center was actually in fact brokered by the US government. And particularly G42, the UAE firm, was also interested in exploring working with the Chinese company Huawei, who is directly competing with American companies over high-edge technologies such as AI and cloud computing. But the US government stepped in and helped with the negotiation process, specifically how my interviewee did not reveal. Thus, in many ways, the surge of investments that started in 2018 and 2019 can be correlated with the alignment of US government's foreign policy interests to counter Chinese influences on the continent with private companies' market interests. In many ways, experts will actually consider this is what it's called like a public-private partnership as like a very successful partnership in many ways. But there are some scholars I've interviewed who are a little bit skeptical where they mentioned that US is moving towards a China model. I'm happy to talk more about that in the Q&A session. So that was just a lot of information and findings covered just now. And as a recap, my research asks, what motivates private US technology companies' recent surge of investments in Africa's digital infrastructure? And I found that in private interviews, market opportunity is a primary motivator over corporate social impact. Well, typically non-geopolitical competition with China is typically internally discussed. However, in public statements, these investments are more likely to be justified to be corporate social impact effort rather than market opportunity. And geopolitical competition with China as a narrative can be cited by one or two companies as an anomaly and their C-suite leadership. In terms of trends from the surge of investments in Africa starting around 2018, 2019, I found that these investments could be correlated with the first Trump administration's Prosper Africa initiative and foreign policy interests in Africa to counter Chinese influence on the continent. And obviously market condition like the roads and consistent electricity are key because, again, these private sectors cannot afford building supporting infrastructures. Looking ahead, there has been a lot of new investments announced in literally recent months. This is all in 2025, and we're only in May. There's so many interests of investing in Africa, and there's so much more that I couldn't fit in this page. And this is just U.S. companies alone. And some of these companies are continent African as a continent base, but they typically have shareholders and investments that come from European partners or American partners. Yeah, so there's a lot of interest in terms of investing in Africa's digital infrastructure, even spilling over into 2025 today. But obviously, in terms of the piece regarding public and private partnerships, the new Trump administration today, as we've seen in the news, has been a lot more focused on domestic government inefficiency problems and kind of trade deficit problems than promoting specifically American investments abroad. So the longevity of these digital infrastructure investments and sort of how successful African countries are really able to capitalize on some of the attention that they're getting from investors from all around the world is obviously a huge question mark. Ultimately, private interests aside, it really depends on the good governance of kind of the investment host country to see how sustainable these kind of investments and how they're able to grow in the future. So I think only time will tell whether or not Africa would be more digitally connected in the future and how successful these projects will really be. So maybe in 20 years time, I'll come back and visit my thesis and see generally what framework I got right or wrong. But yeah, thank you so much for your time.
Hey, once again, we'll go to faculty advisor first, Dr. Call.
Thanks. I promise I'm not the only faculty advisor, just for the first two. So Zhenwei, great presentation. I think that one of the things that jumps out is that Africa is increasingly becoming recentered in geopolitics. By the end of this century, there will be as many people in Africa as there are in Asia, and there will be more people in Nigeria than there are in China. Mostly because China's population is imploding and Nigeria's is going the other way.
Yeah.
But I guess the something that is implicit in your presentation, but I'd like you to talk more about from a policy implication perspective, is that American firms are investing in some places in Africa, but they're not investing everywhere in Africa. China, and that's because market dynamics don't incentivize them to do that. But China isn't making its investments in Africa based on market incentives. They have a plan. There's the Digital Silk Road. There's the Global AI Initiative. So that suggests that there's a role for the U.S. federal government to step in to incentivize investments that are important geopolitically, but wouldn't happen if you just let the market run its course. So if you think about that, where on the continent should the U.S. government be nudging companies to do things they aren't already doing?
Wow, that's a great question. And I know the Dr. Cole actually wrote a really great piece about encouraging US investments abroad to strategically compete with China as well. I would say, obviously, like, because of private incentives, like I think one of the things that really jumped out in my conversations with some of the US State Department officials or like US government officials when having these conversations is that ultimately, even though some scholars are pointing that US is shifting towards a China model, still there's a huge separation between US private sector with the US federal government and sort of the feasibility of how much the US federal government can really, in terms of directing their investments into into sort of the decision-making process for private sectors. And obviously in these cases, like all of kind of Kenya or Nigeria or South Africa, and even including sort of other coastal cities, or basically sort of all the countries with the highest amount of GDP on the continent. So I think it is obviously a question where it feels like market dynamics would be taking over, but simultaneously, definitely it is that like State Department and US government can do more in terms of like allowing these conversations to be ongoing. The State Department official told me that like a lot of the times, like African governments would reach out and sometimes like they didn't exactly rally that back to private sectors. So if that process can be sort of more streamlined and sort of paid more attention to, I think there could be a lot more investments in order to counter efforts, because that's exactly what the Chinese are doing.
Yeah, add Rose next on the list, and then we'll go to you two.
Thanks, Zhenwei. That was a great presentation. So interesting. You know, that big slide at the end with the list of companies, so many companies, that's the one interested in their data centers. It occurred to me that it may not only be profit motive that's bringing them in, they're looking for cheap back office infrastructure and workforce. Does your research support that? I mean, that's a kind of quick impression I have, but does your research support that idea that they're also getting something out of it in terms of not only customer base, but also workforce for their own functions, whether it's back office or perhaps some other functions as well? We know there's been a lot in those days when they were still doing, checking up on posts and so forth and that type of thing. There was a lot of work going on in Africa in that space, but I'm just curious.
Yeah. So obviously, like, this wasn't directly in my research question, so I have some limited knowledge regarding kind of like first degree like data of like what my interviewee specifically said. But I think from my understanding, yeah, indeed, I think some of these like smaller companies are really not investing that much. It's like a couple millions of dollars compared to like billions of dollars, which is what usually takes for these infrastructure projects. So I mean, it's always hard to kind of understand what's their motivation, right? Like a lot of the times it could be just because, oh, I should just set up like a data center on the continent. Oh, like all of my industry competitors are also setting up a digital infrastructure, a data center in Africa, so I should do the same. So it's very much likely that it could be that they're just looking for cheaper alternative options to make sure that their data, since a lot of these companies, like Africa is actually relatively a small market, and some of them justify to me that they're actually more interested in making sure that European or even Middle Eastern connectivity are better. And sometimes that requires routing like on the land of Africa or sort of around the subsea cables in the oceans to kind of go into Middle East or Europe. So that's also a justification. So there's a couple of like multifaceted layers to exactly what they're looking for. But
interesting. Thank you.
We have two people right here, right in front of Rose. And if you want to mention who you are and connection to this.
Yeah. Hi, Zhenwei. My name is Andrew.
Hi, Andrew.
I'm an economics and public policy student, also interested in development and security. So my question, well, thank you for a fantastic presentation, first of all.
Thank you, Andrew.
My question is on, I think, the framework I think about African investment is that any investment in Africa, whether it's like commercial or sort of like more social impact reasons, it is a development project. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts about sort of like this wave of investment in Africa in the context of like USAID imploding and sort of the new American foreign policy stance on development aid?
Mhm. Yeah, so that's a great question. Obviously, yeah, I've talked to some people who were former like USAID employees, and they were really heartbroken to see that like their decade or career-long efforts were really dismantled, like within this one particular administration, of course. But in terms of these investments, since they're mostly private and actually like they're not as affected in that case, since they're not loans, that they're not like World Bank where they're loaning or they're not kind of financing it, like a lot of how China's Belt and Road Initiative are kind of financed, which are ultimately loans, just very favorable terms. But in terms of like specifically how these capitals are actually like deployed is actually really interesting because Microsoft and G42's deal in Kenya, Microsoft is not paying most of it. It's actually G42, the UAE firm, like where a lot of Middle Eastern countries or firms have a lot of capital and they're hoping to divest into kind of technology. So they're actually primarily funding sort of the data center deal in Kenya. So there's a lot of complex structures of like who exactly within the private sector side is really like paying. But from my understanding, I think the federal kind of side from the United States probably is close to zero at this point. Yeah.
So I'm Hassan. I'm an economics major with an interest in infrastructure and finance. And that was an awesome presentation. I was wondering, as a hyperscaler, I have fiber optic cables that can transmit data. Is it really just the cost of doing so across continents that incentivizes me to build a data center in Liberia as opposed to Louisiana?
Mm-hmm. Like, is your question? It's like, what is really the incentive? Why are we building in like
opportunity?
Right, right. I think first things first, it's like the subsea cables, structurally how it works is that like you have all these cables around on the ocean bed, but like if it's just the cables itself, it doesn't do anything. Like you have to connect it to somewhere. So there has to be a landing entry to connect it. So like there's other like cell tower or like different type of infrastructures. And then data centers obviously is storing data, transmitting data, kind of sort of like a mediator process to kind of ensure that like subsea cables data that are transmitted can be actually hooked onto a center. But specifically in terms of like what's the incentive like of like investing in like the US and like Midwest US versus like investing in Africa? Well, I think you see this dual push, right? Like obviously I didn't talk about all the domestic efforts to build like all these like big data centers, like OpenAI has the Stargate initiative and lots of other companies are having these projects to build data centers in the US with the goal of like driving economic growth and sort of placing people in the Rust Belts into sort of like a new type of workforce. But again, like I think going back to Professor Gautam-Muller's question and what I said earlier, sort of these motivations, there could be a lot of reasons. And there could also just be that like African governments are interested and they want some sort of investment and they cut a really good deal in the private sector is like, why not, right? We want to supply more data and energy anyway. So yeah, a couple of reasons to that.
I think we have time for one more, yes.
Hi, Zhenwei. Great presentation. I'm Arnur. I'm an econ major. I'm actually in a project finance class right now, and we talked about the Belt and Road Initiative just yesterday. And one thing that was mentioned is a lot of the BRI's investments are kind of saddling these countries with increasing amounts of debt. For example, one of the examples, Djibouti's quadrupled their debt in the last 10 years, majority of which is associated with Belt and Road Initiative. In any of your interviews with some of these leaders, did they mention a certain preference between working with something that's Belt and Road Initiative associated versus US companies that are funding this with either their money or maybe like a different LP's money? Is there a divide in how they approach it or which one they prefer?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, yeah, it was when I was talking to some of the local kind of like Kenyan government officials and like people that kind of with knowledge within these like infrastructure projects. It's actually a little sad to say that like they're welcoming any types of investments, except it's just the US is not really investing, and that like on a term sheet, like even the term sheets itself, they just can't afford it, and China just offers better financing, right? So at the end of the day, obviously you're seeing a lot of examples of like exploitations and whatnot, and ports being leased and landed, and these are obviously on paper not very fair deals, but for a lot of these African countries, is it like a deal versus that's a little bit exploratory deals. It's like not exactly like ethical versus like no deal. Right. So ultimately that's the question where it's at. And that's why sort of it's interesting to see that like a lot of African countries were really excited when Prosper Africa Initiative was announced. But obviously now the future is to be determined. Yeah. Great. Awesome.
Joining me in thanking Zhenwei Gao. Okay, we just take like a minute to do the changeover to our next presentation. And new people, welcome in. If you're departing, please use the rear exit.
Keep it in the back.
Conducted all the meetings and provided the information to Pam Miller at DOR.
Well,
What I understand, comma,
I asked you not to bring it. I'm going to kill him.
supervisor.
Yeah, Dr. Mordecai is over there. Dr. Mordecai? Erin? Erin? Hi. Hi, everyone. Right.
Okay, I think we can get started. This is our third presentation today. Impact of climate and land use on leptospirosis occurrence and its economic burden in Brazil. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, everyone. So my name is Raina. You're in the right room. My thesis focuses on the impact of climate and land use change on leptospirosis occurrence and its economic burden in Brazil from 2007 to 2023. So you might be asking yourself, why does this matter to international security? Let's go over 3 cases for why diseases actually do matter. HIV, Ebola, COVID-19. These 3 diseases have proven that the architecture of international security, unfortunately, isn't just affected by a state's behavior and war, but it also relies on pathogens, environmental change, and the invisible forces that can destabilize a society from within. There's a great quote by a Nobel Prize winner in physiology, Peter C. Doherty. He said, "War is the greatest of all human disasters. Infectious disease runs a close second." So that leads to my research question, which focuses on how have climate and land use change impacted the health and economic burden of leptospirosis in Brazil from 2007 to 2023. My presentation is going to have 3 parts. Firstly, a background. Secondly, results. And then the policy implications. So without any further ado, let's get to the background. I need to address the elephant in the room, which is a lot of you are asking yourselves, what is leptospirosis? And that's okay. I hadn't heard of the disease till I started researching it. So let's get into it. Leptospirosis, a brief overview. It is caused by the bacteria Leptospira. 90% of cases involve flu-like symptoms, and they're typically found in tropical climates, which means if it's flu-like symptoms, you're just sick during the monsoon. You don't overthink it very much. Other 10% of the time, it's Weil's disease. I have not included a picture here because it's frankly gross, but it's pretty bad. You have swollen arms and legs, organ failure, chronic pain, not the best. So the transmission cycle of leptospirosis is also really interesting, as you can see in this lovely picture here. So the bacteria Leptospira are found in the environment up there. Then they can infect either animals and livestock, or they can infect rodents. A lot of the times these animals or rodents are asymptomatic, and then it can infect humans when they come into contact with these rodents or animals directly or indirectly. Indirectly is through their bodily fluids. That's a very simple overview of the transmission cycle, and I'm happy to detail it more later. You might also be asking, okay, I've never heard of this disease. Does it actually have an impact? Sadly, it does. Leptospirosis is very common, especially in low and middle income countries. There's about 1 million cases a year, 60,000 deaths a year from leptospirosis. And it's most common in the places that are least equipped to handle it. In addition to that, in Brazil, it's not the best scenario as well, because this is just a map of the average number of months that every municipality in Brazil has leptospirosis in a year. And it's pretty high in the south and southeast, which is zoomed in over there. And the dark means more cases and more months. Lighter means less cases and less months. That's a very simple overview. So I then decided to go and actually start my research. So what did the literature say about this disease? The literature review that I conducted suggests that leptospirosis cases are mainly linked with floods and other climate variables like temperature. This is really interesting and is something that I resolved to then include in my data when I was conducting my further research. In addition to that, these are what I would, in India, we call slums, what Brazil, they call favelas, and what as scholars call unplanned urban settlements. So we're going to go with unplanned urban settlements. And yeah, most recent literature has suggested that rapid urban growth, especially for unplanned urban settlements, has led to a rise in leptospirosis cases. This would make sense because if you have one water source that hundreds, if not thousands of people in one locality depend on, that gets infected by a rogue rat or livestock, everyone has a chance of getting infected. So it's pretty simple to understand why it would be related to that. So the data I collected, I will mention all data was collected for 5,572 municipalities from 2007 to 2023. That was 1 million something rows of data I had to deal with. It was not fun. And leptospirosis case data was available from Brazil's Ministry of Health and Disease Surveillance, and it's publicly accessible online for anyone who is interested in that. In addition to that, I collected data on climate variables such as precipitation, temperature, soil pH, etc., from publicly available satellite remote sensing data sets, including ERA5 and CHIRPS. And then there's land use data. So context, land use again is when, like it is a land being used for urban area, agricultural area, forest area. Edge variables, you can think of deforestation. Some of the, the land is not completely urban or not completely forest, it's somewhere in the middle, and that's what edge variables are supposed to be. We obtained this from a project known as the Map Biomass Amazonia project, which provides annual land cover and land use maps of the Amazon. All right, and then to make things simple, I threw everything into a model because we're at Stanford and that's what we do. So I used an XGBoost model, I put in the data, and very simply, I'm happy to talk about the model later, it predicted whether there was leptospirosis in a given place at a given time, that was a 1. If there was not leptospirosis in a given place at a given time, it was a 0. And this is known as an extreme gradient boosting model, and it's predicting 1s and 0s, very simple in that sense. So, methodology summary. We input occurrence data, environmental variables data. The model processes it, and the model spits out 1s and 0s. Hypothetically, this is just a simulation. This is what it would look like. The blue are the areas where there is leptospirosis. White are the areas where there isn't. This is what I'm trying to measure and see if this is possible. In addition to that, I should mention that 97.7% of the time for the data I was dealing with, we had 0s, which means that it is very heavily weighted towards 0s. So we had to weigh the 1s. So the model could notice any differences in the scenarios where there were 1s and where there were not. So I threw a lot of information at you, and that's okay, because it's only going to get worse. Results. So my first research question was, can the model predict leptospirosis occurrence? Because if it can't, me being up here is completely redundant. So let's see. So model performance results. Basically, what I'm looking for is everything needs to be to the right. As far right, the better. Yay, it works. That's the most important thing you need to know. Sensitivity is essentially, if there was a case, did the model detect it? Yes, that worked. Specificity, was there not a case and the model detected that? That worked, yes. These two metrics are really important because, as I mentioned, 97.7% of the time, there's 0s. So if the model just says, okay, there's 0 or 100% of the time, it's still right 97.7% of the time. That's why we need to measure that. It's measuring the 1s when they occur in sensitivity. That's why it's so important. And then AUC, or area under the curve, is essentially a summation of the two, and it combines them to give you a sense of the overall accuracy of the model. So the model works. And 0.5 for AUC is random chance. So it's literally flipping a coin and the model saying 1 or 0. Thankfully, it's not doing that. It's closer to very good to excellent predictions. And that's what we want to see. Next question is, okay, the model is predicting well. But how is it predicting well? What is the data it is considering more? Luckily, there is a visualization technique that we can use to see that. And that is known as a variable importance plot. And basically, I have all the variables I flew into the model here and how much the model used them to make its predictions of predicting ones. And we see that urban area and land use variables in general are really high up there. Urban area is like 3 times as important as the next variable, which is really interesting. In addition to that, you have other things like soil pH that are really up there. Something that was unexpected when I first did this was that climate variables, especially temperature and rainfall, were lower there because that just seems to be going against what the literature has traditionally suggested. But then you also might be wondering, okay, what is the relationship between each variable and leptospirosis occurrence? Because it's not going to be a nice linear relationship for all of them because that would be too simple. And I wouldn't be writing a thesis about it if it was that simple. So this is how urban area increases and the probability of occurrence increases. This is what we call a partial dependence plot. A very simple way to think about this is you hold one, like all the other variable constants, you vary just one variable and you see how the probability of predicting a 1 increases. So we can see as urban area increases, initially it increases a lot and then it levels off. And yeah, the gray lines are just, I ran this multiple times to make sure that one run doesn't skew the average too much. And then I just took an average of all of them. This was done 50 times, took a data run each time. It was not fun. Additional partial dependence plots. So this is farming forest edge area. This is essentially when you've been turning forest area into farming land. And it shows that the probability of occurrence decreases as this increases, which was another interesting result. Another variable that wasn't as important in the variable importance plot, but I wanted to explore was minimum temperature because it shows a really interesting curve. Very simply, bacteria are a lot like humans. They don't like it when it gets too cold, and they don't like it when it gets too hot. So there's a happy medium place that they like to operate at, and that's what this graph shows. So it's a nonlinear relationship, which is really interesting, and that's why this model was great, because it handles them really well. There are more PDPs in the appendix for anyone who is interested in graphs. So I then also started to wonder, okay, we've gone over all of this about how the disease works and all of that, but like, why does this actually matter to policymakers? So I put a $sign on it. What are the economic costs of leptospirosis in Brazil? And so we use this measure known as disability adjusted life years. DALYs, for short, are a WHO standard of the health impact of a disease, very simply. And 1 DALY is equivalent to 1 year of healthy life lost. The way this is calculated seems a little complicated, but it's just years of life lost times years lived with disability. To visualize this, here we have a person living a healthy life. At some point, they get sick with a disease. Then they live with that disease for a certain amount of time. That's their years lived with disability. The years of life lost is when they die before the life expectancy that was supposed to die at as per their country's data. So that's years of life lost is just your life expectancy minus the age they died at. Then you multiply them together to get DALYs. I might be thinking, okay, that's a health measure. How do you get money from this? Thankfully, there is a way to do it. And it's a very simple calculation, which is just you can quantify the economic burden by multiplying the DALYs by the GDP per capita of a country in a given year. And so this equation basically says I'm looking at a DALY value for a specific municipality, like a specific location at a specific time, and I'm multiplying that by Brazil's GDP per capita at that specific time for every year. And this puts everything into dollars and makes it easier to understand. So here is the economic burden of leptospirosis in Brazil. I blew this up because, well, the South and Southeast is really small region spatially, but it has the most leptospirosis burden. And so magnifying it is really important. Darker means there's a higher cost, lighter means there's a lower cost, and white means there were no leptospirosis cases reported there, so there was technically no cost. What we can see on the legend is that in some areas, it goes up to $10 million USD within the time frame that we're studying here. I think nationally during this time, it came out to $150 million. So it's a pretty high cost of disease, and it does not get talked about enough. And then I thought to myself, what if we try to see how that economic cost has changed from 2018 to 2023 in a different time span? And that's when it gets interesting, because that this side here, there's suddenly more color in newer places, and some of the places have gotten darker, and in addition to that, some of the places have gotten lighter, which is really interesting because normally with diseases, you think, okay, as things get worse, sometimes it can get worse, like as climate changes or land use changes, the disease probably gets worse. That wasn't always the case here, but it did get worse in some places, and that's what I was really interested in. That led to my fourth research question, which was very simply, we know urban area is important. Was urbanization responsible for this? So then I did what was called a counterfactual analysis. This is going to be a little complicated, so stick with me. Very simply, we've been using a model to predict whether there's leptospirosis, and we know that the model is pretty accurate. Now imagine we tell the model urban area has stayed constant from 2007 to 2023. Then make the model predict what leptospirosis would look like. And then you compare that with the actual leptospirosis in the country. And I just found the difference between the two. So that's just isolating the impact that urban area has. So no urban growth from 2007 to 2023. Red is basically the areas where the model hasn't predicted leptospirosis, where there was leptospirosis, and blue are the areas that it did predict leptospirosis, where there wasn't leptospirosis in 2023. Basically, red is the thing that I'm really focused on because that isolates the impact of urban growth. And sure, this map is interesting and pretty, if I might say so myself, but it's not enough to just know, is this actually linked to urban growth during this time frame? So I pulled out another map, and this is Brazil's urban area growth from 2007 to 2023. Interestingly, the darker areas are places that indicate the most urban area growth, and that overlays really well with the red areas from the previous map, which suggests that there is some kind of relationship between the two. Can't say it's causation yet because we need to do a lot more research for that, but there is a relationship, and that is a finding. So in summary, because I threw a lot at you guys, I know that. Land use change, not climate change, is the main driver of leptospirosis occurrence in Brazil. Rapid urbanization has contributed the most to the growth in the burden. It's a large hidden cost of leptospirosis in economic terms beyond just case counts. And the municipalities that had the largest increase in urban area, the darker shades I just showed you, are the ones that have the greatest delta in counterfactual in outbreak months. Basically, the red areas correspond to the dark areas from the two maps. So that's cool, this is science, but what does this mean for policy? Glad you asked. So what are the policy implications at the local level? First and foremost, as I mentioned to you in how the transmission works, this is a disease that's affected by the environment, animals, and humans. So we need an approach that deals with animals, humans, and the environment. And that's what the WHO refers to as a One Health approach, which links these three together and works to deal with this problem. Because if you only deal with one aspect of it, you're not solving the problem at all. In addition to that, we know that slums seem to be, or like unplanned urban settlements seem to be a primary driver of leptospirosis because, again, one water source that gets infected, everyone has a chance of getting infected in that area. So if there's a chance of a flood or some kind of natural disaster, it might make sense to create some kind of integrated early warning system. And this has already been done with some success in pilot studies in Salvador, Brazil, and Argentina. And implementing that on a national level would just be good common sense policy. In addition to that, you should probably upgrade basic urban infrastructure. That's always a good thing. Sanitation, hygiene, kind of important. It's not just for leptospirosis. It might reduce the occurrence of other diseases like cholera, dengue, etc. It's just good policy in general. Additionally, most of you didn't know what leptospirosis was, and that's okay. Problem is the people who are being infected by it also don't know what it is. And so if they don't know what they're infected by, they're not going to go out and get themselves tested for it. So improving access to diagnostics is one thing, but we also need to create public awareness because it's fine for us to know what it is, but if the people who are infected by it don't know what it is, we can't get closer to dealing with the disease. Okay, and now policy implications at a global level. First and foremost, we need to work on multinational leptospirosis vaccine development. So remember COVID-19 when different variants popped up and for one variant, the vaccine was less effective than another variant. Imagine that for the bacteria Leptospira, but there's 300 plus variants. So there's a vaccine that's been developed in Cuba in 1989. It doesn't work in Brazil, which is not ideal when you're trying to deal with a disease of this magnitude. In addition to that, we need to start thinking about unchecked urbanization as a security threat multiplier. What this means very simply is it's not going to be enough to create a massive problem on its own, but it can amplify existing inequalities, divisions, and problems in society. Think about COVID-19 and what it exposed all over the world. the way that that disease affected the US alone or India alone was something that none of us could have seen coming, but it got that bad because of the underlying problems that were already there within our societies. Finally, knowledge and awareness. We need to reprioritize leptospirosis because of, a global pandemic, malaria spiking, things like that. It's kind of gone under the radar in the last few years, and that needs to stop pretty quickly. And finally, in general, even though some people may not believe climate change is real, I personally do, and we should probably prioritize the impacts of climate change and land use change research on leptospirosis and other infectious diseases in other regions. Yeah, I think I have like 10 seconds left, so massive thank you to my mentors and my friends for being embarrassing.
Thank you. By tradition, the faculty mentors get to ask the first question.
Really? Okay.
And then raise your hand if
That was incredible. Thank you so much. And thanks for keeping it lighthearted and fun as we were walking us through it. I'm curious whether you looked at the bivariate partial dependence plots between urbanization and some of the climate variables to think about whether climate is playing more of a role in the urbanizing areas, or by contrast, if urbanizing areas are playing less of a role in certain climate zones than others.
I didn't have the chance to do that for the thesis, but that's definitely an avenue of future research because, like, as I've mentioned earlier, there's been research that suggests that floods make conditions in slums and rather unplanned urban settlements worse. And so conducting that kind of bivariate analysis is a pretty good next step. And yeah, once I finish writing up the original draft, I will get on that.
Awesome. Thank you.
Great. Question here, and then we can go to Rose Gadamuller.
Hi, that was amazing. Could you please talk a little more about how you initially evaluated the model that you mentioned under research question 1?
Oh, that's a great question. So what I essentially did was, wait, I have pretty plots for this too. Yeah, so I divided Brazil into 10 different areas. And this was done using a k-means clustering algorithm. Very simply, there was 5,572 municipalities, divided them into 10 areas based on their proximity to each other. So if you look at the pink one on the left here, just like held that out, trained the model on everything else, tested it on the pink. It's basically done because, think about it, if you have Palo Alto and Stanford, there's an outbreak in Palo Alto, you can pretty much predict what the outbreak in Stanford would look like just based on the proximity, similar weather, and things like that between the two. We don't want the model to do that because the disease is popping up in new places. So being able to train it to generalize across times and spaces is why we did this. And it became 60 because we trained it for 6 different years by 10 folds. So 6 times 10.
Rose Gadamuller next.
Thank you so much, Raina. Ever since I heard about this project, and your briefing was excellent, but ever since I heard about it, I wanted to ask you, how come you chose leptospirosis and Brazil? Tell us the origin story for this project.
So Brazil ended up being a really great case study because firstly, it just has the disease data available, which a lot of countries don't, and it's extremely painful for them to give up disease data. I initially envisioned working on India as a project because of obvious reasons, but the Indian government is not very easy to work with at the best of times. So I ended up going to Brazil because they just have publicly available data and have really granular data. In addition to that, leptospirosis, honestly, my mentor, Ali, told me it's a disease that needs to be studied more. I looked into it, realized it was common in India, and I had never heard of it. And that annoyed me enough that I decided to do a thesis on it.
Well, thank you so much. Just a quick two-finger. I think it's really valuable because I don't think a lot of people around the world recognize that Brazil really does have a pretty good national health service with this kind of free data. And no, I'm really glad you brought it to more people's attention. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, actually, Brazil has a actually remarkable data collection in general across a large number of variables, and it's available for free. It's all digitized. It's online. So it's something they collect very systematically. So it's actually, if you're looking for that kind of municipal level data for a country, Brazil is a great place to study.
Yeah.
Lots of people and lots of different geographic regions. So it's big enough to study one country, but yet a lot of ecological variation too.
Yeah.
Great point.
Hello, Raina, great presentation. I'm Sophie, another CSAC honor student. I was interested, now that you have these like very technical and rigorous research methods to evaluate the disease of leptospirosis, are there any other diseases, either in Brazil or in other regions of the world, that call your attention as possible future research projects where you could apply similar methodology to evaluate what might be driving these diseases occurrence?
I think there's always more diseases we can study. My hope is I just want to study the ones that go unnoticed, because like this disease causes 60,000 deaths a year, especially in low and middle income countries. And those are the places that often have the least resources to deal with this. And I think for me, it just has to do with, like, there's a lot of other neglected diseases that the lab that's helped me through the entire thesis. The Mordecai lab works on, like schistosomiasis and leishmaniasis, some of which you probably never heard of. But it's okay, I hadn't heard of them till I joined the lab either. But it's very cool work that's being done. But my contribution would be more people need to get into this space and do more work, because the problem's only going to get worse, as your thesis notes as well, with climate change. So we should probably do something about that now rather than later.
I'm Izzo. I'm another CSAC honors student, and a similar question to Sophie's. I'm interested in, I think we've sympathized a bit about the simulation and modeling process, and I'm curious if you have thoughts on how you can deploy this model in the future beyond the scope of this thesis, and if you're going to safeguard it in any kind of way, because it strikes me that maybe you could do you think you could change the data inputs to study a different region maybe?
I know I can, because when I started working with the Mordecai lab in question, I was using a very similar modeling methodology to study this disease in Peru, specifically in the Madre de Dios region. So it has broader applicability, but it's also a question of the variables that you choose to include, because say, for example, in Madre de Dios in Peru, mining area was more important than it was in Brazil. And it also depends, you have to do your own research into understanding what variables might be important in different regions, because it's not going to be a very simple relationship for all of them. But I think there's potential to use the model, but the data compilation and collection process is a little painful, I'm not going to lie.
Great work. That was awesome.
So very short, I'll take Chair's prerogative to ask a very short question. I know during the thesis development process, we talked about whether the role of urbanization.
Mm-hmm.
And sort of based on how you describe the disease transmission process, I'd always imagined that edges would be super important, because that's where you're running into animals that are potential. But it sounds to me, you seem to be implying from the way you're presenting, it's actually about water sources and where do unplanned urban areas get their water from. And I just thoughts on, because clearly your data shows that urbanization matters a lot more than edges. So any thoughts on that?
I think edges are probably also very important. It's just that based on the data we were able to collect. And one thing I wasn't able to mention because of time is initially we had a lot more variables, but say, for example, we had precipitation and what we call runoff. So how much like water can flow around the ground and spread over a given area. Problem with that is those two are very correlated. And when you give a model variables that are extremely correlated, it can sometimes confuse the impact of one and attribute it to another. And so for this thesis, we did have to make some decisions where we had like urban forest edge, which ultimately was not a variable included because of its high correlation. And we ended up running the model and like the variable importance for different ones. And this is the one that proved the most accurate and produced the most like clear variable importance plot. So tough decisions had to be made in the modeling design, but it's definitely something I would like to do more work on.
Okay. Please join me in thanking Raina for a terrific presentation.